Welcome to our bare bones study on forgiveness. This is session 1. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about, and by the way, this is not, even though it's a bare bones study, this is not something that we don't want to know about for where this group is in the education. You're going to see why this is important shortly for Romans Education Part 2. And so, and we'll make that connection when the time comes. But I want to talk to you today about forgiveness because this is something I think that is misunderstood by a lot of people. In the past, we have talked a lot about the different kinds of suffering. But today, I want us to focus on one specific kind of suffering. and we already know that all of those sufferings come under those two divisions. That is, the sufferings of this present time and the sufferings of Christ. And we already know. Is anybody here that isn't sure about the difference between those? Because those sufferings of this present time are just the sufferings that happen because you happen to live in a fallen world. The sufferings of Christ are the sufferings that come about because Satan wants you to quit your sonship life. If you do quit, these will go away. If it's the sufferings of this present time and you quit your sonship life, they just do what they do. Doesn't matter. All right, so we've seen that, and we also know from what Paul has written to us that it is through suffering that the power of God's grace can rest upon us. Now, I want to talk about that issue just for a second. If we want the power of Christ, we're going to read a verse on that in just a moment in 2 Corinthians 12. If we want the power of Christ in our lives, then here's the first step. We're going to have to accept the sufferings. Now, I'll talk to you about what that means, but I think you get the idea. Because we're accepting those sufferings, we know that we have accepted those sufferings when we can do what Paul did, and that is to glory in them. So, we'll talk in just a moment about what that means to glory in those sufferings. But either in your notes or in your Bible, look with me at 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9. And he said unto me, now remember the context of this. Paul's been praying 3 times about God removing this thorn in the flesh. And now verse 9. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And what I'm talking about here is the power of Christ rested on Paul not just because he was suffering, but it rested on him when he responded correctly to the sufferings. So just because you suffer doesn't mean the power of Christ is automatically rested upon you. When Paul learned to glory in his infirmities, that's when the power of Christ rested on him. That's what that verse is saying. And so when we suffer, we know this. We get one of 2 things. And I want you to hear this because you're going to have to choose which one you want. You either get the misery of the suffering or you get the power of Christ. You have to just kind of figure out which one you'd rather have. I know it sounds like a no-brainer, but people choose the sufferings all the time. And so I'm going to talk to us about that. In the book of Philippians, Paul talks to us about the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. Look with me in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 10. He says that I may know him. This, by the way, is one of Paul's prayers. He says that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. The part that's highlighted there, that I may know the fellowship of his sufferings. So what is that fellowship? Well, in order to know that, we have to know what it means, what fellowship is. Well, I think you kind of have an idea on that, but let me show you the Oxford English Dictionary definition that we're after. It means participation, sharing, and then they did this parenthesis, in actions, in condition. It means something in common. It means a community of sentiment. What is sentiment? Yeah, it's how you feel about something. It's how you're thinking about something. And so in a nutshell, here's what fellowship is. It means our thinking is in common with each other. We're thinking the same way, and we're responding to the sufferings the same way as Christ. That's the fellowship of His suffering. So that's important. So let me just put this up here, because we're going to refer back to this by other phrases that are describing the same thing. So the fellowship of His, talking about Christ suffering, the fellowship of His suffering means we're thinking about it like Him, and we're responding to it. This is our actions like Him. That's what it means to know. And when Paul says that I may know the fellowship, he's not just talking about just intellectual. He's talking about I want to experience that. I want to know. I want to know what that's like. I want to be able to have that. And so Paul, when you're looking at this verse, Paul is not, he says that I may know Him and the fellowship of His sufferings. Is Paul praying to suffer? No. What's he praying for? Yeah. He's saying, I want to respond to these sufferings the way Christ would respond to these sufferings. That's a godly response. That's a Christ-like response. Now, look, let me just show you this. This is this fellowship of His sufferings, that is the same issue as when we talked about our joint heir inheritance. Does anybody remember what the condition was? And we are joint heirs with Christ, if so be that, yes, that we suffer with Him. And that phrase right there, with Him, that is describing that. Can you see that connection? It's just being said in a different way. This is the way it got introduced to you. This is very simple. We're going to suffer with Him. What does suffer with Him mean? It means, and by the way, when we say suffer with Him, we're not talking about Jesus' suffering today like you're suffering. He wasn't in a car accident. What are we talking about? We're talking about this. We're talking about when we suffer with Him, it means we're thinking about the suffering the way He thinks about it. And we're responding to it the way He does. We're with Him. When someone says, this is what I'm going to do, and they go, are you with me? What are they saying? Are you thinking about this the way I'm thinking about it? Do you see it the way I see it? And so that's what the with Him is. I just wanted to say that means because we know some things, we're now looking at it and reacting to it in accordance with what we now know. And what do we know? Well, what the doctrine tells us. By the way, if that's a prayer for Paul, he says that I may know Him and the fellowship of His sufferings, and he's saying, I want to experience that. Wouldn't that be a legitimate prayer for us as well? To say, look, when I'm suffering, I want to do like Paul. I want to, remember, I keep saying this because I keep thinking this is what you're thinking, not by what's on your face. But I'm afraid this is what you're thinking. Paul says, that I may know Him and the fellowship of suffering. Paul is not praying to suffer. If he was, he would just say, I pray to know Him and His sufferings. But he says the fellowship of his sufferings, which means he's saying, I'm not praying to suffer, I'm praying to think about and feel about those sufferings the same way Christ feels about them, the same way he thinks about them, and to respond to them the same way he would. Does everybody get that? That's what that means. That's what the fellowship of his sufferings means. Look, would you say that among the people in this room, there is a fellowship of sonship? You know what that means? It means we all think about it the same way, and we're engaged in it the same way. That's the fellowship aspect. Well, in this life, there is going to be sufferings. And what Paul is saying is when those sufferings happen, I want to look at those sufferings the way Christ looks at those and respond to them the way he would. Because you only have two choices here when it's suffering. You can either have the misery that comes with the suffering, or you can have the power of Christ. But that comes as a result of this. The only way you get the power of Christ to rest upon you is when you begin to think about the sufferings the way your Father does and respond to them the way he would. That's the only way that happens. But when that happens, something wonderful takes place for you. And we're going to talk about the effects of all that in just a moment. But that's a great prayer for us as well. And we realize that when Paul is praying that, now just think about this. Was there ever a time when Paul said, Lord, I want to know the fellowship of your sufferings? Does God just go, oh, well, okay, here, I'll just give it to you? No, that's not how that happens. How does he know that? By obeying the doctrine that is written, allowing that doctrine to change the way he thinks and now change the way he responds. And that's what is going to produce that in him. And so what does that do? Let's suppose, because if you're thinking about it and responding to it like him, there is the opportunity for the power of Christ, or the power of God's grace, to rest upon you. And what does that power do? So let me just ask you, does that power make the suffering go away? No. Does that power make it so even though the sufferings continue, it doesn't hurt anymore? No. What that suffering does is it impacts the negative effects that suffering would have had on you. So that the suffering doesn't, in this case, for instance, the sufferings of Christ are made to do what? Make us quit our sonship life. If we start responding to those sufferings this way, the power of Christ will negate the effects. We won't want to quit. Because we'll see something happening in us that is of such great value, greater value, by the way, than just removing the suffering, that we won't want to quit. And that's what we really ought to be looking at. And so, and this is what has been happening for Paul. Now, most of the time when we think about suffering, what do we think about? Most of the time when someone, you're talking about physical suffering. I've been injured some way, or maybe I'm sick, or something has happened like that. But now let me ask you a question. Can't mental suffering sometimes be just as debilitating as a physical suffering? Yep, they can. But listen, the kind of sufferings that I'm talking about today are not the kind of sufferings that come from anxiety and worry over a circumstance. But I'm talking about mental sufferings that happen because someone has committed an offense against us. Because someone has wronged us. Because someone has said something hurtful and mistreated us in some way. That's the kind of sufferings that I'm talking about. Now listen, those sufferings can be a part of this, and there's coming a time when they are going to be a part of this. As a matter of fact, when the sufferings of Christ start, that is going to be some of the first ones that we will encounter. I'm telling you now. You know what I've discovered? It does almost no good to tell people things ahead of time, because then when the thing comes, they act like they never heard it. I'm hoping that this group is smarter than that. So I'm telling you that when the sufferings of Christ really crank up, one of the first thing is not to threaten your life and strip away all your income and take your home. The first thing is that people are going to say things about you that are hurtful. And you know why Satan is doing that? Because he's counting on the fact that you don't know what to do when that happens. And then you will eventually get tired of that, and you know what you'll do? You'll quit. Because as soon as you do, that'll stop. The criticisms will go away. And they'll be gone away unless you crank back up again, and then they come back. So the better thing to know is, how do I handle that? What do I do? See, doesn't this... You should be on the edge of your seat going, yeah, tell me. But wait, be patient. I'm not there yet. Okay. So, here, this is wonderful. I get to play both parts. Okay. So when someone has offended you, when someone has said hurtful things, when someone has mistreated you, what about that? Well, first of all, it is really easy for the policy of evil to keep us from responding in a godly fashion. Do you know why it's easy? Because our flesh, when those things happen to us, it wants to do the very opposite of what the doctrine is going to call us to do. Our flesh, and you know what? Listen to me carefully. We're all like this. I'm not talking to two people in here or a couple of people out there that's listening to the recording. We're all like this. Look, if somebody does something to Gloria, it's real easy for me to say, God, Gloria, get over it. But now, by the way, that's not the Bible doctrine. I'm just saying, that's how we do it, right? Get over it. But when it happens to me, yeah, now it's like, I want some justice. That's how we feel, right? How about let's have a godly response to this so that we're not affected by all of that the way that we would have. Well, a lot more to say about this, but just stick with me here. The point I'm making is, it is easy for the policy of evil to keep us from having a godly response, because our flesh automatically does the very opposite of the godly response. So we know that's not the right thing to do. So what is the doctrine we should be living out of? And how do we respond to those kinds of sufferings in a Christ-like manner? Well, like Paul, there are some things that we need to know. And once we understand those things, and we begin to live out of them, that begins now to make a difference for us. So this is what I want us to talk about. So when it comes to being offended, when it comes to being hurt by someone, it is helpful to know. I'm just trying to think what I should write up here, because I want some things to stick in your mind. When someone does those kinds of things to you, God is not the one instigating them to do it. Now, I know that sounds simplistic, but I have something more to say about this. I have something more to say about this than just the fact that God is not the one that's behind this. That is the starting point, but there's another aspect of that. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it is comforting to know that God is not using them to somehow punish us. You can go back into the Old Testament and you can see how God used the Assyrians to punish Israel and the Babylonians to punish Judah, but you're not living under the performance system of the law. You're living under grace, and God's not doing that anymore. And so anybody that wants to take those Old Testament principles and apply them to you today, what do you know? They're wrong. What did Paul say? They are vain janglers. They know not what they say or what they affirm. In other words, that's a nice way. I don't know if it's a nice way, but it's a way of saying they don't know what they're talking about.
Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
I know that they don't usually say it like he's the author. They say it, he's allowing it as if he's doing it for a purpose. Can you cover that?
Okay, so Marcus, let me repeat that for the recording. So Mark is saying sometimes people say, okay, God's not doing it, but He is allowing that for a purpose. That answer is right and wrong at the same time. So thank you for bringing that up. It's really good. I'm saying that sincerely. It is wrong because the way most people mean that is God kind of instigated this in order to get something else to happen. But see, the point is, God is not the author of this. He's not the instigator of this. He's not trying to manipulate people into doing anything to accomplish His purpose that way. God is not arranging circumstances. When you decide to walk through the park a different way and find a $20 bill laying in the grass, God did not put the thought in your mind to have you walk a different way so you could find $20. Somebody was going to find it eventually, but it is right that God is allowing people to do that, not for the purpose of accomplishing something, but that now becomes an opportunity for something to happen. Does that make sense? So God's not, okay, so let's use Gloria and Sarita. So Gloria turns around to Sarita and says, "Oh, you look nice today," and kind of rolls her eyes. And Sarita gets her feelings hurt. Well, did God instigate Gloria to do that in any way? Absolutely not. Did He allow Gloria to do it? Well, He did. But did He allow it because there was something He wanted to do? Not necessarily. But what He is saying is, Sarita, if you do get your feelings hurt because Gloria was ugly to you, here is an opportunity for something eternal and valuable to take place in the midst of that. God's not saying, I want it to happen or I'm glad it happened, but if it does happen, I have something for you. You don't have to just say, oh, I'm just the recipient of Gloria's insults. You don't have to do that. So God, does that kind of answer the question for you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a little bit. Okay. Okay. So if you have a part of that you feel like I need to address, hey, just bring that up, and we'll do more. So the mental kinds of sufferings. Can you see that someone may say something hurtful to you, and it's just part of living in a fallen world? You know, maybe, you know what? Maybe her husband yelled at her this morning, so she's already on the edge. I don't know. But it could also be someone will say something hurtful to you as part of the sufferings of Christ for the purpose of making you stop your sonship life. But God is not instigating either one of those. But He has something for you in both of those that is meant for you to be able to patiently and lovingly endure that to His glory, and the effects they would have had on you, that's what the power of Christ overcomes. By the way, You say, well, what about these sufferings? Because these are not given to me to make me quit my sonship life. What's the effect there? Well, and in fact, you know what? I raised that question now. I'm going to give you that. I'm going to show you what the effects are. And once I start on that, you'll all see it. Well, I guess we're at the point in the notes where I can actually talk about it. So this is great. The effects of the suffering, you know, they're the very opposite of the spiritual good that God wants to accomplish, right? Okay. Now, having said that, here's what it will produce. The effects of the suffering produce spiritual death in us. Not good things, but bad things. And so, in what way are you talking about, Brother Mike? See, everybody does this kind of thing. It'll be spiritual death for you. But what does that really mean? What is that? Can we identify that? Absolutely we can identify that. It's a poison that this offense is going to, if you don't deal with it right, it's going to put something in your soul that is absolutely going to produce spiritual death in the end. But it is going to poison you from the inside out. And here, I'm going to identify it for you right here. Bitterness. Now let's look, you can look in your notes at that Oxford English Dictionary. Look at the definition of bitter. Expressing intense grief, misery, or affliction of spirit. And now look at bitterness, feelings of resentment and anger. And if you allow that, if you those things that are sitting right there, if you allow this intense grief and misery and affliction of spirit to continue in you, then it's going to produce the noun of that, and that is feelings of resentment and anger. And that's going to build up in you. So I want to talk about the godly remedy for these kinds of offenses and not letting that take root in your soul. Have you ever encountered anyone who was just bitter about someone or something? And they were just consumed with it? You don't ever want to go there, but you want to deal with this in the way that the Bible is going to tell us to deal with it. And so here's the default. Now I'm just going to give it to you now, but I'm going to explain it to you. What's the cure for bitterness? Here's the cure. Forgiveness. That's the cure. But you misunderstand what I mean by that. I'm looking at you, and you're wonderful people, but you misunderstand what I mean when I write that up there. And you're going to see it. I'm going to show it to you here in just a moment, how we misunderstand it. Because what you think I'm talking about is not what I'm talking about. But it will be in just a moment. Okay. Did you realize also that most people who are bitter do not realize they're bitter? In fact, if you say that, you say, look, I just think you've just gotten bitter over this. They'll go, oh, no, I haven't. Okay, Linda acted it out. No, I didn't. Another sign of bitterness, But what do they think? I mean, they really don't think that they're bitter. You know what they're thinking? I've been hurt.
They're thinking for me.
I've been offended. I'm not bitter, I'm just hurt. But look, if you leave that hurt alone, that is where it will eventually go. And you have to avoid bitterness. Why? Boy, I just really wish I had the PowerPoint because this list is powerful. But let me just talk you through it. Do you realize there are physical consequences to bitterness? When that happens, that will begin to affect you physically. You won't feel well. And you'll be more prone to be sick and just feel miserable generally. Now, I don't want to get into the details of that because I have so much to cover. What I got left here? But here's the next thing. Not just physical problems, but emotional disorders. You can become an emotional wreck if you let bitterness take root. And you know what it does? Have you ever been around someone like that? You know what that does? It drains you. They just sap the energy out of you. And you know what it does for them? The same exact thing. Because that now sends them into this. This is the emotional toll. Depression. And they just feel like they just can't lift themselves out of it. And you know what's going to happen? You know what's going to happen if they do that? You can say this to people, and look, when you're not in it, you look at it and you go, yep, that's right. But when it's happening, you just can't see it. So here it is. Here it is. You got offended. You didn't want to forgive them. It started affecting you. You got bitter. You got angry. You started getting depressed. And you know what the next step is? You become just like the person who offended you. Emulation. That's what happens. So you can say that to someone, and you know what? A wife will say it. She'll go, you know, the son is always griping about his dad. Oh, my dad wasn't good. Oh, he does that. My father, I can't. You know, he's always griping, always complaining, always criticizing. And then one day she goes, you know what? You're just like your father. And you know what he says? You know, you're right, dear. No. He goes, I'll never be like. You know what happened? The bitterness has now made him into the very thing that he despised. But he can't see it because he feels like he's the innocent party here. It's really it's not because he's the innocent party, it's because he wouldn't take the Bible remedy for this whole situation. So now, let's go to the next one. The next one I've listed for you there is not just affects you physically and not just affects you emotionally, but it affects you spiritually. It puts them into spiritual bondage. Here's the mistake people make. I can be bitter against this person and still love God. Let me show you what John, in your notes, by the way, I wrote the word Jesus. Scratch that out and put the word John. I don't know why I put that there, but it says Jesus addressed this issue in Israel's program. Do you see that? This is John. I saw that this morning and I thought, why did I write Jesus there? Oh well. So look at this terse statement, 1 John 4:20. If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he's a liar. What? That's not very politically correct. John? For he that loveth not his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God love his brother also. You know what's happening? Someone says, don't tell me that. I may hate this person, but they deserve it, and I do love God. You're deceived about what love really is then, because John says, if you hate your brother, you don't love God. There's something missing out of your understanding of all of that. So we think just because we get a little emotional trill when we think about God that suddenly we must love Him. Well, not true. My question would be this. Well, this is God's Word. Do you love this verse? See, I mean, this is tough, right? By the way, you say, well, Brother Mike, you're right, but I notice that's in 1 John. That's God's program with Israel. I rightly divide the word. Well, good. Let's give you one out of Paul's epistles. Ready? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31. Let all, first thing out of the box, bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor, we'll talk about what that is in just a minute, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Put all that away. Wait a minute, that evil speaking, Anybody want to take a guess at what that is? Look at the context that's in. Bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking. What is that? Yeah, you know what? It's taken this person that you're angry with and bitter at, and now all the venomous things that come out of your mouth about them, that's the evil speaking. You know what? Out of the abundance of the heart, what? The mouth speaketh. And it's true in this dispensation too. Yeah, in other words, you are not going to live like that. How do you put, okay, so Mark is saying, I need to repeat the question. Mark is saying, so when it says, be put away from you, what does that mean, to be put away from you? And it means, don't engage in these things. Don't let those be a part of your life. How in the world do you put those away? But why would you need to put them away? This goes to the heart of his question. Why would you need to put them away? To put them away means what? If you have to put something away, it automatically assumes what? That they're already there, right? In what way can bitterness and anger and wrath and clamor and evil speaking, in what way are they already there for us? That's right. That is the natural response of our flesh. Oh, yeah, I think that's Mark says, so is this another way of saying don't walk in the flesh? Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think I know that you could say it that way. And so now, and by the way, we're going to talk about how this process works. I'm going to show you the mechanics of it here. I don't know if we'll do it in this session, but we'll certainly do it before we end. When the Apostle Paul got saved and began to serve Christ, you realize that prior to that, he not only had great standing in the nation of Israel and had great respect from all those religious leaders and was looked at by people with a certain amount of awe for his accomplishments and for who he was. But when he got saved and began to serve Christ, all of that went away. And the people who before were his best friends now became his worst critics. All of the accolades that he used to have, now, no. Now, all manner of evil speaking was being done about Paul. And how did he respond to that? Well, let's read it here in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 7. He says, but what things were gained to me? In other words, those things that made me somebody or actually helped me, as I worked in this world. Those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. That's Paul's way of saying, all of those things that used to be so important to me, I wanted people to think well of me and say good things about me and point to my accomplishments. He said, but when I came to know Christ, you know what I realized? Those things were really nothing to brag about. Those were not medals to be worn or accomplishments to be lauded. He said, I counted all those things as loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus. Now I'm about something different. Do you think if Paul stood here, he would say, I just think the things that I used to do in this world were just so important. I don't know if I'll ever... Or do you think he would say, no, what I'm engaged in now is of much greater value than anything I was able to do before? You know that's what he would say. That's what he's saying right here. And so, as I told you a while ago, forgiveness is the remedy for bitterness. But how do we forgive someone then? What's the process for that? And so I'm going to give you a 1, 2, 3 here for this. And so, and so we're now going to start thinking about our offenses. By the way, can I just, there's a 50 little things I want to say to you on the side as we talk about this. And sometimes I choose not to talk about it, and sometimes I do. But as I was putting this together, don't think as I'm sitting there putting this together that this isn't striking me in the heart. Have there ever been people that have said ugly things about me or hurt my feelings or been critical? Okay, there was one guy, but he died, so okay. But no, it's not that at all. Look, of course that goes on. Does it even go on from people that you consider to be brethren? Sure it does. Sure. The people that you would think would be the last ones to do that. Would it even be said by people maybe in your family? Sure. That's true for me. So as I sat there, you know what the first temptation was? I'm just being honest. I mean, it was just for a second, but you know what the temptation was? Yeah, let's skip over this part, or let's kind of water this down a little bit. Because this is uncomfortable now because you have to deal with this. Now, it's just there for a second, but you realize in the same moment what? If this is really going to work, then we just have to do it. Right? And that's what this is about. So let me walk you through the mechanics of this.
Before you do that,
Uh-huh.
you said you were going to tell us about clamor.
It's coming up. Yeah, it's coming up. We're going to read that verse again. Thank you for bringing that up. And there was something else I was going to say to you. I just want you to know this is not a sermon I prepared just for you. If this isn't working in me, I think this is where preachers don't get it. If it's not working in you, I don't think you can really convey that to the folks that you're trying to teach. I only think you're responsible for that, but I think that's one of those necessary ingredients that lends more to what you're saying than just words, than just saying words. You know what I'm saying?
Would that kind of be like an apt to teach?
You know what? It's funny because Mark and I were talking about that very issue this morning. He was over at the house printing the labels on the disc, and we were talking about that being apt to teach. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if you don't have it, you really can't give it to. Just think, if you don't do it, and someone comes to you and says, "What do I do about this?" You know what? You don't really have the godly advice to give them. You can give them all kinds of worldly advice, but that doesn't work. So I am now giving you the 1, 2, 3. So when someone comes to you and says, "What do I do?" Here it is. Or if you find yourself in that condition and you go, "What do I do?" Here it is. Now this sounds like I'm just giving you points. But the first thing I'm doing is, and I'm going to change the way I wrote it there, because the way I wrote it in your notes, it looks like I'm just giving you some points. But I want you to understand what this is about. So here's step number 1. Change your thinking. Because the way you're thinking about it naturally is, I need to get even with this guy, or you know what, he needs to apologize, or she needs to, make this right, or what, that's what's in your thinking. Change your thinking. Here's the thinking. Thank God for the opportunity, first of all, that this offense affords you. That's the first thing. So I'm going to put that in parenthesis down here. Thank God for the opportunity. Not thank you, God, that I'm suffering. You get that, right? It's not thank you, God, that they said something terrible about me. But God has something for you here. See, someone would say, you know what, someone tried to hurt me, and here's what I'm doing. I'm praying for God to do this to them. But He's not going to do that. Well, does that mean He's okay with it? Well, no. But what does He have for me then? He has an opportunity for some other things to take place with you. And here they are. I've listed them for you. So let me just bullet them here. The first thing is This is an opportunity for real spiritual growth. Now, in what way do I mean that? You're going to have an opportunity to put forgiveness into motion. Okay, well, what else? You got another option? You ever see that insurance commercial where they're riding, the quarterback for the Packers is driving the car and his Allstate agent is in the back seat and his football agent is in the other front seat? And have you seen that? Am I the only one that's seen that commercial? And he goes, at the end, he goes, quit messing with my discount. He goes, well, what are my other options? And next thing you know, he's on the side of the road walking, right? Well, that's what people want to say. Oh, I have an opportunity to grow spiritually by putting forgiveness into action. And they want to go, what's my other options? All right, I know the buzzer went off. Let me give you these last three, and then we'll stop right here. No, we're not going to stop right here. Hold on. I'm sorry. I'm giving myself 10 minutes. Gosh. Sorry. If I don't do this, we're not going to get it. Here's the second one. Suffering is an opportunity to experience God's grace. Who wouldn't want that? I mean, the power of His grace, of course. Here's another one. This is an opportunity to glorify God. That one should be pretty high up on our list of things we would like to do. If it's not, I think we have other issues at play here. Number 4, here is an opportunity for Christ to be formed in us or in you. Here's an opportunity for Christ to be formed in you. You see, we read about that and we go, yes, I want to be conformed to the image of God's Son. And God goes, okay, here's how you do it. But what are my other options? Because we don't want I used to say it like this. People love a good end product. They just hate the process of what it takes to get there. This is the process. So, 1 Thessalonians 5:18. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. Notice he said not for everything, but in everything give thanks. What was my point? My point was, thank God for the opportunity. Why? Because we're told in everything, which would include being offended and having hateful things said to you. In everything, give thanks. What could I be thankful for about this? Well, I've given you 4. I'm betting the folks in this room could give me 6 more. But there's 4 to be thankful for. Again, we're not thanking God for the offense. But He did allow it to happen. And He allowed it to happen so that we have the opportunity for these kinds of things to take place in us. How important are those? How important is your spiritual growth? How important is it for you to experience God's grace? Not just talk about it, but actually experience. How important is it to glorify God? And how important is it for Christ to be formed in us? Well, here's the mechanics for that. God is not responsible for the wrong things that people do. But He has promised to use their wrongdoing to help us in some very important ways. These things are more important than not ever being offended. You understand? You say, well, I never got offended. But look, if you did get offended, these are worth way more. Can I use terminology from Romans 8? The offense is not worthy to be compared with the things that can be accomplished in our inner man. And so God has promised to use those offenses to benefit our sonship life. So let me get these out and then we'll stop for the break. So what are those promises? Where did he promise to do that? Well, I've given you 4 right here. He promised us a joint heir inheritance through suffering. Romans 8:16. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we're the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him. And what does that with him mean? That's right. It means experiencing the fellowship of his sufferings. What does that mean? It means thinking about those sufferings the way he does and responding to them the way he would. The second promise, he promised that all things would work to our good through that suffering. Romans 8:28. For we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Do we believe that? Do you really believe that? Well, if you do, then you know what? This makes you less worried about what people say. Because now you realize this is an opportunity now for you to build your joint heir inheritance. Think about that. Because you're going to be suffering with him. In other words, you're going to be thinking about it like him and doing what he would do. You're going to be with, and he goes, hey, and joint heirs, if so be that we suffer with him. This is your opportunity to build your joint heir inheritance. Now, I know you're not going to go, woohoo, somebody criticized me today. I got more joint inheritance coming. But you have to respond right to it, right? So, I mean, you know what? I admit you would be a little bit goofy if that's how you approach all the bad things that really happen to you. But when they do happen, instead of overwhelming you with anger and bitterness and malice, what you're doing now is you're going to change the way you think. Remember that verse? And put away all bitterness and anger. How do you put that away? Change, you know what? Mark said, couldn't we say don't walk after the flesh? Sure you could. Change the way you're thinking about it. Don't think about what they did to you and how terrible that was and what you'd like to have happen to them. Now, you're going to talk about this is an opportunity for spiritual growth. This is an opportunity to be conformed to the image of God's Son. This is an opportunity to glorify God. So we change all of that. And that's what's happening in Romans 8:28. We become more than conquerors. Here's the third promise. Romans 8:37, nay, in all these things, by the way, I should have put the verse in there that told you what those things were. They're terrible things. In all these things we are more than conquerors. What does it mean to be more than a conqueror? If you're a conqueror, you're a winner. What does it mean to be more than a conqueror? It means by going through those things, you are greater coming out than you were going in. It has added something to you of real benefit. And then we experience eternal glory, 2 Corinthians 4:16. For which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. For all of these reasons, see, God's already promised, look, when these bad things happen, I'm going to give you an eternal weight of glory. When these bad things happen, I'm going to make you more than a conqueror. When these bad things happen, I'm going to make you a joint heir. When these bad things happen, I'm going to use those bad things for your benefit. I'm going to grow you spiritually. I'm going to give you my grace. You're going to glorify me. You're going to be conformed to the image of my Son. If that means anything to you, now you understand, here's the opportunity for that. I'm really not glad they did this to me, but I'm really glad God didn't just leave it out there for nothing. He has now allowed this to take place. And that's worth something. So, the way we respond to sufferings is how we put the power of God's grace on display. Because if we look at all of this and we say, well, that looks really good, and Mike talks about it, but You know, what was done to me, we all think this, don't we? What was done to me is a special case. It's above whatever has happened to any person ever in the history of the world. But even if that were true, you know what? His grace is still sufficient. It is. And if we look at this and we discount this, then we have made it really easy for the policy of evil now to begin working in us to the place where we will never love God the way we're supposed to, and we'll never love others the way we're supposed to. We'll never be the son or daughter we're designed to be. And Satan couldn't be happier with that process. He has an ally, your flesh. And it wants to naturally do exactly what he wants us to do. Okay, so with all of that, let's stop right here and we'll take a break. Because when we come back, now that I've laid this groundwork, I have to give you the next two steps. The first step is to change the way you're thinking about what has happened. And you do that by, first of all, looking at the opportunities that are now before you. I know I said we would stop, but before we do, all right. I don't like to talk about things other in these sermons. I may use something to illustrate something, but I don't really like to give my opinion about things outside of this because it becomes a distraction. So, but by way of illustration, when all of the debate came up about climate change and global warming, I have my own understanding of the truth or falsity of all of that. Let me say it that way. But even there are meteorologists, climatologists on both sides of that issue. So I'm trying not to address the issue because that's not the important thing. But what I'm saying is, I read some information from a guy who does not believe that global warming is taking place, and he has, just like everybody else, he has his evidences for why he doesn't believe that. But I was surprised by this. He said, but I am really grateful to the people. There's a way in which he was grateful to the people who brought all of this up, because it now allowed resources to actually gather the data that's out there. Then with the whole world's in a discussion. I mean, do you remember, I don't know, back when President Obama was in office and he was over at the G4 or whatever it was, and he said, the biggest threat that faces us today is climate change. And people who agreed with that cheered, and people who disagreed with that were, dismayed. But you know what? When you have that conversation going on all over the world, now you know what happens? More time and money and effort is being directed at something where you can really get to the truth of whatever that is. Whereas before, that was such a non-issue, nobody could, you know what? Nobody was pulling out any money to fund that kind of research. He said, so in a sense, I'm really glad for that. Even though I don't agree with their conclusion, I'm glad for the discussion. So in a way, terrible illustration, I know, because now you're all thinking about climate change. Stop thinking about climate change for a moment. Here's where I'm going with that. You may not be glad that someone offended you, but there is a way to be glad, because now you have some opportunities that were not present before. Still stuck on climate change, aren't you? I knew it. Fine, take a break. Get over it, Gloria, or Sarita, and then we'll come back. All right.